Hello, hello. I'm Casey.
And I'm Fallon.
And this is
Render the Darkness.
We are back today for part 2 of Darlie Routier. So welcome back to the second part of the case. In this episode, we'll be going over the evidence and trial and everything used in court by both the prosecutors and the defense to try to determine if Darlie was innocent or guilty. I will say before we start to be prepared for a topsy-turvy ride in this one, because for every piece of circumstantial evidence or every inconsistency that the prosecutor was able to point out, the defense was able to either disprove their claims and theories or they were able to redirect it somehow.
Okay.
This really was not only one of the most high-profile cases in that area at the time. I actually think still to this day is one of the most high-profile cases for that area. But also one of the most heavily debated cases due to the results being fairly easily questionable. Was Darlie wrongfully accused, or did she stage the scene and commit the crimes herself? I will do my best to provide you with all the information you'll need to make that determination by the end of this episode.
I've kind of already got mine in hand, but...
Yeah, it was, it's hard to dispute a lot of, if you remember the first episode, it's hard to dispute a lot of that. So, if you remember the first episode, it came out a couple days ago. We talked about the actual crime itself and a couple of the stories given by both Darlie and Darren about the events that took place, and the interviews and some of the evidence, but not a lot of it. So, first, let's talk about Devin's 7th birthday, which took place just 8 days after the incident. His birthday was on June 14th. This was in 1996. Darlie invited a film crew along to celebrate his birthday, and it was, to say the least, very bizarre. It literally looked like they were having a party. They were laughing, running around, playing, singing, and even spraying silly string all over the grave.
Oh, gosh.
I also would like to add that the boys were buried together, so she wasn't only spraying silly string on Devin's grave, but also Damon's.
Oh.
It seemed really inappropriate for the circumstances, but when asked about her behavior that day, Darlie would just say that how excited Devin had been to turn 7, so she wanted to celebrate his day the best way she knew how. She would also go on to claim that the cameras didn't show her reaction to being at the boys' grave just before the festivities, where she was sad and somber. I'm going to let you decide on that one. The footage from this day was definitely used against her in court. In fact, the prosecution relied on it pretty heavily, claiming the video showed proof of her lack of emotion towards the death of the boys. 4 days after the party they threw at the boys' gravesite, Darlie would be arrested for the premeditated murder of Devin and Damon.
Good.
I will say, too, that I know she claims that, and a lot of the friends and family that were participating in that event also tried to claim that, but I did watch a clip of that video, and when somebody does cry or tear up or whatever, there's certain things left on the face that are clear signs that somebody has just done that. Redness, puffy eyes, there's just signs. She didn't have any of those. Absolutely zero.
Because she didn't cry.
And I will also say that in the video, Darren is not participating in the celebration. He's kind of standing off to the side with his head down, very somber. All the things that she described herself as being are the things that Darren was.
Okay.
So, we left off part 1 giving Darlie and Darren statements in their police interviews that took place just 2 days after the horrific events of June 6, 1996, so June 8th. That's when the interviews took place. Let's go over one of the first noticed inconsistencies, and that was Darlie's story. What she was telling officers had happened on the night of the attacks compared to what she told them in her interview 2 days later didn't really match up. While the paramedics were starting to perform life-saving procedures in an attempt to help little Damon, Sergeant Walling was outside with Darlie, who at this point was now on the front porch. While she was being gauzed by paramedics, she reconfirmed to Sergeant Walling the story she had told Officer Waddle when he had arrived earlier. She told him that an intruder had entered the home and mounted her on the sofa as she slept. She woke up to him being on top of her, she screamed, fought her attacker, and blocking his attempted blows. He then ran towards the garage, and that's when she saw the boys, of which she claimed to hear nothing during the attack on them, which had happened just before her attack right next to her.
But that's not what she said.
That is not what she said.
At all.
Not even close to what she said.
Wow.
If you remember in her statement to the investigators on the 8th, just 2 days after telling this version, the one that I just said, she gives a completely different version of events. She tells them that Damon ran into her yelling "Mommy," waking her up, and that's when she saw the man standing in between the kitchen and the couch. Let me not leave Darren completely out.
Okay.
He, too, would make a comment that seemed pretty out of pocket for the situation. Just before leaving to follow Darlie to the hospital the night of the attacks, Sergeant Walling would report that Darren had just stopped to say to him, had stopped him to say to him, "Golly, I guess this is the biggest thing Roulette's ever had," end quote. Keep in mind, he said that while his son was being loaded onto a stretcher and his other son laid deceased in their living room floor.
Wow.
And his wife was suffering from injuries that nobody at that point knew the extent of yet.
Right. That's lost for words. I don't even...
Which, yeah, obviously, Sergeant Walling thought that was a strange thing to say,
Yeah.
but not to play devil's advocate here, but just like I did for Darlie in part 1, at the time that he said this, the house was completely covered in officers and investigators, and neighbors had gathered, so I could see him being overwhelmed by the amount of people and activity and being in a state of shock. I don't know, maybe it was an out-of-pocket thing to say, but I kind of think he just really maybe felt overwhelmed in that moment, and that comment just kind of came out wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that.
Like, maybe he didn't mean it the way that it sounded. Maybe he just felt like it got so much attention so quickly that it was just really overwhelming, maybe.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, there were many things about the scene and Darlie, like her behavior and the story she gave, that struck officers and investigators as odd. For example, I mentioned in part 1 that the screen in the garage had been cut,
Right.
but based on the way it was cut down the center, which means not only could that cut have come from inside or outside the house, it also meant that it would actually make it a lot harder for an intruder to escape through it. Another one of the main points of focus was that not only was there proof and testimony that Darlie made zero efforts to do anything at all to help her sons, despite being told 3 separate times to do so, she also never once asked about the condition of Damon, who at the time he was taken in an ambulance. When he was taken in an ambulance, he was actually still alive. Right. So her last knowledge of information before she was loaded in an ambulance was that life-saving procedures were being performed on him and he was being rushed to the hospital.
Right.
But not once did she ask about him. Another thing I mentioned in part 1 was that the bread knife thought to be the knife used to cut the screen had particles of the screen on it.
Right.
Meaning that they used the bread knife to cut the window and then returned it to the knife block.
Right.
This was something prosecution brought up in trial, but defense had their own answers to this.
Okay.
The defense team actually brought in a couple forensic specialists to re-examine the bread knife. Their names were Terry Labor and Bart Epstein. They would go on to testify that the fibers the investigators so confidently tried to claim were from the window screen could have just as easily been carried onto the knife from the fingerprint brushes. They pointed out that the investigators dusted the window screen and sill for fingerprints, right before using the same brush to dust for prints on the bread knife. Therefore, the materials could have either been redeposited onto the bread knife from the screen that way, or the particles could even have been from the actual brushes themselves, which often leave behind very similar particles found on the knife.
No.
That's what they used for their defense on the knife.
No. That's just my opinion. No.
Well, I would also like to bring up another note mentioned about the window in the garage. Not only were there things in front of it, but just next to it, I think I read it was immediately to the right, on the outside, was a bunch of mulch, which was said to be dewy and wet and also completely undisturbed.
Okay.
If someone had gone in or out of that window, it would have been next to impossible for them to not have disturbed that mulch.
Right. Yeah. And some of it would have probably been inside the basement or the garage as well, coming off their shoes or their knees or however that works.
Well, if they had used that window to come in, then yeah. But
Yeah.
I think the idea or the argument here is more focused on the fact that she claimed that's how the intruder exited.
Oh, did she ever say how he got in there?
No.
Oh, I was thinking he got in there that way and then out the
they
same
never
way.
they never verified how. I think it was assumed or implied that the intruder supposedly went in and out of the window.
Yeah.
But the only thing she claimed was that, no matter what version of her story you listen to or hear, the intruder was already in the house by the time she woke up and seen him.
Okay.
So these are all based on her saying that's how he exited.
Okay.
Was, running through the utility room and into the garage.
So he was already in the house.
Mm-hmm.
She woke up. He was on top of her.
In one version, he was on top of her.
Okay, so she's seen him. He grabbed a bread knife.
Mm-hmm.
Ran and cut the window.
Yeah.
Ran back, stuck it in, and then out the window again?
Correct. Unless you're going with the defense version. But either way, the knife was put back in the bread box.
Yeah.
Or you could go with the defense version where they're trying to say that bread knife was never used to cut the screen. The only reason there was screen particles is because of the fingerprint brushes.
Yeah.
So if their version is correct, then the bread knife was never used. Therefore, nobody had to go back and put it in the bread box or the knife box because it was never used.
Okay, so if that was the case, if it was never used, then why did they fingerprint it?
They fingerprinted all the knives. They
fingerprinted all of them.
Yeah, they fingerprinted everything.
Okay, I got you.
Well, the reason they fingerprinted those knives is because the knife that was used in the attacks was one of their personal knives from that knife block. So they were thinking that if they dusted everything in the knife block, there may have been other fingerprints, that maybe they had bumped another knife or...
And there was no particles on any other knife but the bread knife?
Just the bread knife.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's where another kind of argument between prosecution and the defense came into play. Mentioning the malt and how it was undisturbed. I will say, something the defense brought up, there was a concrete path from the gate that did go underneath the window. So it is possible, maybe the intruder high-stepped over the mulch, which is technically true. That could have happened. It could have been argued. But if the intruder was fleeing in a hurry, it wouldn't have made sense for him to go that way because it would have added a substantial amount of time to his path of escape.
Right.
It would have been considerably faster to take the path out through the mulch.
Right.
Let's also mention here that there was dust still on the windowsill, which, you guessed it, was also undisturbed in any way.
Oh.
Which kind of indicates that nobody ever went through that window at all. There was also stuff sitting in front of this window that clearly was not disturbed in any way. So if an intruder was fleeing and had someone chasing him, would he take the time to steer clear of all the debris in front of the window?
No, that stuff would have been knocked all over the floor. It would have been slung everywhere.
You would think. Also, if an entire body had somehow pushed through the screen, wouldn't there have been some kind of sign that had happened? This screen was cut smooth, with no signs of any further disruption to it. Plus, they also determined that there wouldn't have been a reason for an intruder to cut the screen at all, as the screen itself was extremely easy to remove.
See, I was gonna ask about that, but I wanted to wait because like you said, if an intruder went through it,
Mm-hmm.
there would be like a big, like it would have ripped the
No,
screen.
it was just if you look up the pictures of the screen, which you can, it's just one smooth cut.
So nobody went out that window.
Undisturbed smooth cut.
Yeah, nobody went out that window.
Plus, it is one of those really easy. You could just like push the buttons and pop it
like
out.
Little tabs.
Yeah. So one quick push on it, the window would have come right out.
Okay.
So somebody had to like take their time and be careful with cutting it, even because if they had pushed too hard in the cut, the screen would have popped out.
Right. Mm.
They did actually end up finding 2 prints on the ledge of this window, surprisingly not bloody. You'd think they would have been if they left after, if they were left after the intruder fled.
Right.
Which is another thing that made this window such a heavy point of focus. But for the time of the trial, they didn't test the prints because the investigators claimed that there wasn't enough of a print to run. But the defense would question this claim, bringing in 2 fingerprint experts who determined there absolutely was enough of a print to run it.
Okay.
I will point out that although this isn't relevant to the trial, in 2019, I think it was, during an appeal set forth by Darlie's defense team, they have agreed to test the fingerprints, but from what I could find, the results of the testing still have not come back, or if they have, they haven't been released and they didn't help her.
I'm just going to go out on a limb here. My opinion again. They're hers.
There's another point of focus, which was the sink in the kitchen. As well as the blood splatter that was present in the kitchen, the blood splatter pattern, it just simply didn't match Darlie's versions of the events. As for the sink, it seemed odd that the sink was completely clean. The strange part about it was the fact that the floor and the edges of the counter all around the sink were covered in blood, which made me think that someone had taken the time to clean the sink. Made them think that as well.
Yeah.
Which it could be argued that maybe when Darlie wet the towels for her neck, it washed the blood out, but even if that's true, the sink would have been completely clean.
No, there would have been like some kind of like pink or whatever kind of residue, just kind of
something. Well, not only that, but they did a luminol test, and for those that don't know what that is, it's basically a black light that allows someone to see fluids or liquids that have previously existed that may no longer be able to be seen by the human eye. So they did the luminol test on the sink. It lit up like a Christmas tree.
Okay, so I got a question. I don't know if I just don't remember it from the first part, but did this happen in the kitchen?
Well, no, it didn't, but that's supposedly he dropped the knife in the kitchen or in the utility room, and then she brought the knife back into the kitchen and put it on the counter, and then when she called 911, she went into the kitchen to get the phone, and then she went to the kitchen sink to get the towels for her neck, not for the boys, but for her neck.
Okay.
So no, but keep in mind, everywhere that she traveled, she was covered in blood.
Okay.
Like she was from neck down covered in blood.
Okay.
So she easily could have been transferring blood all over the place.
Right. That's why I was confused. I was like, wait a minute. I was like, I don't remember it happening in the kitchen. I just kind of lost that.
At no point did it actually happen in the kitchen, minus one, a couple of the versions of the story where she chased him through the kitchen.
Okay.
And then I think there was another version of the story too, where when she fought the attacker off or whatever, I think part of that attack supposedly was claimed to have happened in the kitchen. In one of the versions of the story, like there's like 17 different versions of this story she gave. Like it's a ridiculous amount of versions that she gave. It's like 16 or 17. I don't know. I think I say it later.
Well,
but speaking of the luminol test, another strange thing this test showed was that there was in fact a small handprint that appeared on the couch, which was determined to be Damon's handprint because that's where he was stabbed. But it only appeared in the luminol test, which means someone had taken the time to clean that print off the couch. And again, we're posed with the question of why.
That's terrible. I hate that because I can just see it in my head.
Little tiny hand. By the end of the investigation conducted at the home, not only was there zero evidence of forced entry, there was also zero evidence of anyone going in or out the window in the garage where Darlie claimed the intruder fled. And also, there were no signs of robbery, which is questionable because there was a lot of really expensive items just laying out in plain sight. So ultimately, outside of a person coming in specifically to harm the two little boys and their mother, there was no motive found for why an intruder would have entered the home or that there ever even was an intruder at all.
I'm going to go with the latter.
I'm kind of leaning that way too.
Yeah.
There's also just the attacks themselves. This is going to be a little bit of details.
Oh, don't do this to me.
Sorry. There was also just the attacks themselves. The boys were stabbed aggressively, multiple times per child. Why wasn't Darlie stabbed? Why did her attacker only cut her? Why didn't the blood patterns add up? She had claimed to have fought off her attacker, assuming her first telling of the events was correct. If she did that, then why wasn't there blood splattered all about in the area she claimed it happened?
Right.
Another thing I don't think I've mentioned yet is that there was a bloody sock found in a ditch. I actually read it was an alley in another source, so I'm just going to include that just in case that's the correct one. The sock was found just down the road from the Routier home. It was determined that the sock contained Devin and Damon's blood as well as Darlie's saliva.
Oh, what?
They also found hair from either a leg or arm. They found animal hair from possibly a deer or elk. And they found synthetic fibers that matched Darren's shoes that would be discovered in the utility room. Why was that so far from the house?
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. I know I have a lot of questions, but hopefully this doesn't mess anything up. But did she have any defensive wounds besides the cut on her neck?
She claimed to have defensive wounds, which I mentioned in the first episode, but they were determined that they could have easily been self-inflicted, and none of them were. They were all superficial.
Oh, okay.
Could have easily been self-inflicted.
All right.
But there was some, and we'll talk more about all that too a little later on. We're getting close to that.
All right, sorry.
No, you're fine.
Keep messing me up.
Nope, it's good.
Like, hey, tell me. I want to know. I need to know these things.
You're good. We're going to go over all that as we go. This sock would go on to play a pretty heavy part in the trial, with prosecution left trying to explain why Darlie staged the sock and not really having a plausible way or reason as to why she would do so, and the defense claiming the sock as part of the proof that Darlie couldn't have been the one who did it because there's no way she would have had time to put the sock near there, nor could she have done that without leaving any trace of evidence behind, such as blood outside or something.
Unless she put it outside and like an animal ran away with it.
There were many different versions and scenarios as to how that sock could have got there. Many. There were also footprints found leading from the living room to the kitchen, only as far as the kitchen sink, and back to the living room. She claimed Devin was with her, but only her prints were found. And in another retelling, she claimed she chased the attacker to the utility room, but the prints didn't go that way.
Oh, and you figure, with all the...
Yeah, I mean, at one point she says that she followed the attacker into the utility room to pick up the knife.
Right.
Her feet prints don't go that far.
Mm-hmm.
Lieutenant Wally would later testify that both Darren and Darlie were not only barefoot when he arrived, but he checked both of their feet for blood and didn't find any.
Oh.
Their feet were clean. However, another officer, Officer David Mann, would say he did find a pair of Darren's shoes that had blood on them, and after testing those shoes, it would come back that it was Darlie's blood that was on them. I do want to make sure I mention all the facts that I could find, so I don't cast light one way or the other, but rather just say what they found and what was brought up in court. That there was hair found on the knife determined to be the murder weapon, and that hair also belonged to Darren, not Darlie.
Mm-hmm.
This fact seemed to be kind of ignored by prosecution. In fact, there are several moments where physical evidence was presented in the trial that didn't match to Darlie, but the prosecution chose to kind of sweep it away, and instead they focused more on circumstantial evidence. It seemed kind of like they had this pre-painted picture they were trying to convey, and they were doing their best to not deviate from it. I know I just said I don't want to cast light one way or the other, but that was for the facts I was presented, not for my opinions.
Gotcha.
I'm not saying she is or isn't guilty. I'm just saying there were some things found and mentioned that had it gotten a little more focus, might have contributed to a different outcome of the case. And this isn't to point the fingers at just the prosecution. The defense fell Darlie here too because they were specifically appointed to utilize this type of evidence to create a point of reasonable doubt in her charges, but they too failed to do so multiple times.
Well, everybody knows what my opinion is.
I'm trying to be as biased as possible. I'm definitely going to voice my own opinion at the end of the case, but while I'm telling the case, I'm trying to give the facts and information as unbiasedly as I can.
I understand. I'm just saying.
There actually was a print found in the garage, but there was debate as to whether or not that print was tracked in by an officer, which it ultimately was decided it was based on nothing more than Lieutenant Crone arguing that the print was there when he went into the garage the first time. They didn't test this print to verify if it was an officer's or not. They just went with it, and that was it.
Why are they not testing these prints?
They didn't even bother to find which officer it supposedly belonged to.
Wow, okay.
So, there were some things that they definitely failed to do here.
For sure.
So this case was definitely the whole thing was definitely mishandled in a lot of ways from the beginning. There was blood found on the bottom part of the utility room door. There was also a shoe print found on the floor. And it looked like maybe someone had pushed the door with the shoe, or somehow the shoe had come in contact with the door, which was strange because there was blood found in the utility room door. There was blood found on the utility room door, but nothing found in the garage in the initial investigation. Not a drop.
Huh.
Which makes it kind of seem like maybe that too was tracked in by an officer.
Okay, I can see that, yeah.
Another observation was that the gate was closed. If someone fled out the window, and let's say the theory that they took the time to steer clear of the mulch and took the concrete to the gate, you're telling me they also not only closed the gate back, but they also opened it?
Right.
Which it's been noted by several of their neighbors as well as Darren and Darlie themselves that gate was notoriously hard to open.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Also, no blood was found outside anywhere, minus the sock. So going back to the living room area where Darlie originally claimed to have fought with the attacker, at least in one version of the story, the only evidence of this was a lampshade that had been slightly moved and flowers that were laying on the floor, but none of the flowers had fallen out, nor were they broken. So, suspicious. I don't know if you've ever knocked over flowers, but they typically fall out or break unless someone took the time to very carefully place the flowers on their side. Yeah. Then maybe not. Just saying.
Yep.
Suspicious. There was also the position of the broken glass from the wine glass that had been broken. There was glass which was not bloody, laying on top of the bloody footprints found in the kitchen that were determined to have belonged to Darlie, which means the glass would have had to have been broken after the print had already been left there.
Right.
Remember in her story, she claimed that she heard glass breaking.
Right.
There's also blood. There was also blood under the vacuum. And you know what else was found underneath the vacuum?
The other sock.
More glass.
Oh.
There was also a bloody shoe impression found on the carpet behind the couch. That strip of carpet was collected but never tested. This print was found very close to where Devin was laying. Another piece of evidence was the blood splatter on Darlie's nightgown. It was determined that the pattern of the 4 droplets found on the shoulder of the nightgown was consistent with blood spray from, say, if she were stabbing something or someone.
Oh.
Even more distressing was that they did actually test these blood spots, and when they tested the spots, it came back that 2 of them were a combination of her blood and Devin's, and the other 2 were a combination of her blood and Damon's.
Poor babies.
I will say, though, I think one of the most damning points of evidence was just how often Darlie and Darren changed their stories. Darlie gave 16 different versions of what happened that night. Each version providing a different telling of details, such as where the attacker was, how and why she woke up, and where Damon was. Getting back to some of the fingerprints found, there were some that couldn't be identified as belonging to Darlie or Darren, which would be the one that was found on the coffee table and the one that was found on the kitchen counter. And needing to rule out everyone in the house before the trial, unfortunately, due to realizing that they did not get a copy of the boys' prints before burial, they had to be exhumed. Upon doing that, it was determined that the print on the coffee table did not belong to Devin, but Damon was not ruled out. It could have been his print.
Okay.
You got to keep in mind, when the boys were buried, they were buried holding each other's hands.
Oh my god.
So it was really hard to get prints. As for the kitchen counter print, it was thought that it might also belong to Damon. However, an expert for the state would testify that Darlie couldn't be ruled out from that one either. What he actually said was that the print could belong to a minor, but wasn't big enough to make a full determination of who it could actually belong to. There was also an unidentified hair at the crime scene. Now, there was a point where Darlie had claimed that her panties were missing after the attack, and the hair they found was said to be identified as a pubic hair. They did do a rape kit on Darlie at the hospital, but as it often happens in these types of cases, somehow they lost it.
How do you lose a rape kit?
You tell me. You tell me. Somehow they lost the rape kit. Sorry, the R word kit.
Oh.
It was argued in court that whoever the attacker was, it was done with such force and intent that the prosecution argued that it was personal, especially when comparing the injuries of the boys to Darlie's. When comparing the injuries, the boys were stabbed. Darlie was cut, but not stabbed.
Right.
Darlie had bruising that the doctors who worked on her confirmed had to have come from a blunt object, but according to Darlie, the attacker only had a knife, and the boys didn't have anywhere near the level of severe and deep bruising that she had. One idea that was argued in court was that it was possible that Darlie could have easily sustained the bruising if, let's say, the boys were fighting desperately for their lives, i.e. kicking, flailing, punching, especially with where her bruises were located. And it was, I don't think I put it in the first part, but I will say that it was determined that Devin also did have defensive wounds, so he did fight his attacker as much as he could. She was right-handed. If she used her right hand to hold the boys down and then stab with her left, the bruise positions would have lined up almost perfectly to that. And it was very apparent, at least on Devin, based on his injuries. Like I said a second ago, he absolutely fought as hard as he could for his life. And another position that was argued with regard to the bruising is that none of her bruising was consistent with the bruise pattern she should have had if she had been held down in any kind of way, which is if she was fighting against her attacker as she claimed in at least one version of her story, or if she had been R-worded like she implied. There should have been bruising consistent with that.
Right.
But one thing I have to mention is that the medical care team who actually saw Darlie the night of the attack testified that she didn't have any swelling, redness, or any stages of bruising while she was in their care. Keep in mind, the pictures of her bruising weren't taken until 2 days after the attack.
Okay.
Although, again, for the sake of giving all sides, there was one doctor who claimed that the bruises she ended up having could have happened on the night of the attack, but then he would later also state that they also could have happened on the 8th, which was the day she was released from the hospital. So he said they could have been either or,
right,
basically. There's also a lot of Darlie's behavior that didn't really seem like the reaction of a woman who had just gone through what she had claimed to have just gone through. And yes, I realize people respond differently in traumatic events. I realize shock can be a factor and that it's possible her brain just wasn't fully processing things as it otherwise would. I know all that. But some of the things she was saying just didn't seem indicative of someone who had just lost two of her children. For example, when she was in the hospital, she was in the same room as Devin, who was laying in her proximity, naked and exposed.
Oh.
It was reported by the staff of the hospital that Darlie just looked over at him and then turned her head forward and just stared, not responding to the sight the way one would anticipate a mother might seeing their baby in such a horrible way. There's also the fact that her focus of anger seemed to be more about the way she was being portrayed by social media and newspapers rather than having just lost her children. She apparently had one freak out at the hospital, and it wasn't about losing her boys, it was about an article that she had read.
Oh, lovely.
She also was concerned about the embarrassment that the police might come across her and Darren's toys.
Oh my gosh, really? Not that big of a deal. I'm sure most couples, I'm not saying all couples, I'm sure most couples probably have a little secret box or drawer. Who cares?
I mean, why is that something you're even thinking about right now? It was also...
I keep wiping my nose.
No, you're fine.
Tearing up a minute ago, so...
No, you're fine. It was also testified that she seemed far removed from emotion about the boys at all. They even went so far as to call her cold to the situation, claiming she never shed a tear while she was in the hospital, despite all of her family who visit her being described as hysterical and inconsolable. But she simultaneously made sure to persistently mention that she had picked up the knife, almost as to ensure everyone, including hospital staff and the officer who interviewed her, while she was still in the hospital, making sure they understood why her prints would be found on that knife.
Yeah, because that's the most important thing.
Yeah. When it came to the cut on her neck, it was testified that the cut was consistent with a self-inflicted wound, and that was based on evidence of a hesitation cut within the cut.
Oh, so she did it and was like, oh.
So whoever did it, there was shown hesitation before the cut, or at the beginning of the cut. There was also the fact that Darlie was very much over-exaggerating her injuries, which seemed strange. It came across as if she was trying to gain some kind of sympathy with it, or trying to possibly make it seem like her attack was more vicious than it actually was. I don't know. Just all those things combined seemed strange, considering the circumstance and the fact that most of this happened the night of the attack or within 2 days while she was in the hospital. Most of the cuts she had, it was testified that not only were most of them not consistent with being attacked, but that they all could have very easily been self-inflicted. Let's move to more examples of what appeared to be Darlie's lack of concern for her situation. She was approached at the boys' wake by the Routier's sometimes housekeeper, who expressed her deepest condolences and expressed her sympathies for not only the boys, but also having the cost of the boys' funerals now being added to their situation. She reported that Darlie flippantly responded by saying, quote, "I'm not worried. I'll get $5,000 for both of the boys." End quote.
Oh my gosh.
It was also testified in court that she never shed a tear during their funeral either. In fact, it was reported that Darlie was actually the one going around comforting other people during the boys' funeral. She also seemed to focus more on the flower arrangements that had been sent for the funeral rather than the funeral itself. Another strange comment made by Darlie... Sorry, this case just infuriates me. The more I read it, the more angry I get. Another strange comment made by Darlie was when she had a friend of hers drive her back to her house to get some clothes a few days after the boy's funeral. She arrived at the house, which she had not seen since the night of the attack. The friend testified she was shocked when Darlie's response to seeing the crime scene in her house was simply to say, quote, "Look at this mess. It'll cost me a fortune to fix this shit," end quote.
Oh my God.
This shocked the friend.
Wow.
This shocked the friend, who then testified that in response to this comment, she asked Darlie to tell her that she did not kill her boys. And Darlie's response to her asking her whether or not she killed her boys was, quote, "I'm going to get new carpet, new drapes, and fix this room all up," end quote.
So she didn't even address the question.
Didn't even address the question. Just continued to focus on what all she was going to have to do to clean the mess up.
Wow. What a terrible human being.
Yeah, she's a monster.
I mean, I'm going to say, even if she didn't do it,
just a monster.
Still going in my opinion. Horrible. Terrible person.
I mean, yeah, I don't think there's anybody who can hear these details of this case. And like you said, even if you think she didn't do it, just her behavior and her responses and just everything else combined, and not helping the boys and not really showing any emotion towards the situation, like all of those things combined, whether she did it or she didn't do it, just a monster.
Yeah. It's like she just didn't care.
Another strange event that was testified about in court was Darlie and Darren playing catch with one of the teddy bears that was on one of the wreaths placed at the Routiers' home in honor of the boys. This happened on the 18th of June, 1996, just 12 days after the attacks, and coincidentally the day Darlie was arrested for the murder of the boys.
Why would you do that?
You tell me.
Just why?
Their neighbor testified that the couple were throwing the bear back and forth and using the bed of their truck as kind of a goal shot. Every time the bear made it in, Darlie would hoop and holler and cheer. Darren tried to claim that it was Darlie's sister he was throwing the bear with, but this claim was kind of discredited due to A, the difference in age between Darlie and her sister, and B, the physical differences.
Well, I mean, even if it was not her and he was doing it with her sister, you're still doing that. You're the father.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't be doing that.
It kind of makes you wonder how much of what he was doing was a show.
Right. That's just...
And there also was the fact that this neighbor had lived across from the couple for 3 years. So she knew what Darlie looked like.
Right, yeah.
Basically, when it came to the breakdown of the trial, prosecution painted the picture that Darlie committed the crime and staged the scene to appear as though someone came in and attacked the family that night. This was based on evidence from the scene, evidence that her story was not accurate, combined with the physical evidence that defied logic that there was an intruder. The lack of evidence of there ever being an intruder at all, doctor statements that Darlie's wounds were superficial and most likely self-inflicted, coupled with multiple testimonies surrounding Darlie's lack of emotion, her refusing to make any attempt or effort to help her children the night of the attack, the video of her at the boys' gravesite having a party with Silly String just 8 days after the murders, the testimony of her continuous string of out-of-pocket comments and nonchalant demeanor about the event all the way around, and the continuous changing of Darlie and Darren's stories about the events of the night. Another point I want to add that wasn't able to be used in court, but I thought it was interesting. Darlie and Darren both took a polygraph test. Darlie's test results were never released, suspiciously. But Darren failed his test.
Oh.
He failed on questions such as whether he knows who killed the boys, or if he had anything to do with the planning of the murders.
Oh, no.
The defense had a really difficult path in front of them to disprove or argue against all the overwhelming points of contention brought forth by the prosecution. Ultimately, the trial would last almost a month, and in the end, the jury deliberated for approximately 7 hours. I think it was 7 hours or 7 days. I didn't put that in there for some reason. And would ultimately find Darlie guilty of capital murder. She was given the death sentence. She was to be executed by lethal injection. Darlie's defense immediately requested an appeal. So the digging for proof of Darlie's proof continued, or Darlie's innocence continued, and in the name of fairness, I will include some of those things now. One major thing that was discovered was that Darren was actually planning a staged break-in. He was planning to have someone break into the home and steal Darlie's jewelry so he could make an insurance claim on the jewelry.
Okay.
This brought up more questions of just how involved Darren actually was. Darren and Darlie divorced in June of 2011.
Okay.
Which is crazy because he stayed married to her for a long time. Wow. Before they divorced. And he still to this day proclaims her innocence. Another thing that was brought up was the fact that multiple neighbors reported attempted break-ins on the night of the attacks, and even more people reported seeing suspicious men and vehicles around the vicinity of the Routier home.
Huh.
Which I did read. There was like 5 or 6 people who had reported. Now, it wasn't until after her trial, but they did finally come forward and say, like, there was at least 2 people who did have someone try to break into their home, and they were within a block or 2 of the Routier household.
Okay.
So there were people supposedly out on the prowl trying to break into homes. Darlie's appeals were denied until 2008. They finally decided to grant some DNA testing on some of the blood stains and some of the evidence collected from the garage area. The appeal also had used the argument that Darlie's defense failed to do many of the things they could have done to help prove Darlie's innocence, or at least prove there would be reasonable doubt to convict her, therefore claiming she wasn't given a fair trial through point of defense. The DNA testing that they did perform, the results came back in 2015, and needless to say, it didn't help her case. Mm-hmm. The results came back as belonging to her and also possibly Darren. Mm-hmm. She is still to this day sitting on death row in Dallas County, Texas, and she is still attempting to appeal her case and prove her innocence. She is convinced that eventually DNA testing will prove she didn't do it, despite the fact that over 100 DNA samples have been tested, and all of those tested samples have come back as belonging to Darlie, Devin, and Damon. Like, I try to do my best to be impartial in the facts of this case, but she did it.
I would say I wasn't impartial at all. Like,
she did it.
Yeah, she did it. Terrible human being. Don't come at us.
No, you come at me if you want to. She did it.
She did it. She's terrible human. I don't even want to say human. I don't even want to. Just terrible.
Yeah, I tried really hard. I know this could sound really horrible on my part, but I tried really hard during the writing of this case to never at any point directly refer to them as her boys.
Yeah.
Or as her sons or her children. Just because, and I know that that's terrible, and I don't really want to say that either, because you got to keep in mind too, their other son Drake, who was 8 months old at the time that all this took place, he's still very much alive. He also still very much feels his mother is innocent. So I don't want to say anything too derogatory on this case or hurtful on this case or matter of fact, because there isn't really any matter of fact outside of the things brought up in trial, and there's a point of opinion, but
I mean, in the DNA that just links her to everything, and you say Darren too, right?
There were some things that came back with Darren's DNA on it, but it was things like his shoes and things like that like his sock, things like that.
But they didn't find DNA of anybody that didn't live in the house.
Nobody that didn't live in the house, correct?
So whoever did it lived in that house,
correct? But there is also still DNA. That they thought maybe belonged to the police officer or whatever, that I'm not sure if that was ever tested.
That's true.
So I'm still trying to be impartial. I'm trying to take into consideration that she does still have a living son out there. Right. Darren is still living out there who still thinks she's innocent. She has her mom, other people who still stand behind her innocence.
Right. Yeah.
So, I'm not trying to be overly opinionated in a hurtful way. I'm just basing my opinion off the facts that I read while doing this case, and they're pretty damning.
Yeah.
They're pretty damning. And like I said, even if she is innocent, even if she didn't do it, just the way she reacted in the situation, and again, I've never been in that situation. God, I hope I never am in that kind of a situation. I don't know how I would react in that situation, but I would hope to God I'm more sympathetic.
Yeah.
And more concerned about something other than myself.
Yeah, see, what I don't understand is like, yeah, okay, how people can react to these things differently.
Right.
From like whenever it first happens, you're in shock. Things can be a little foggy, but 2 or 3 days later, even at the funeral, there should be something there, in my opinion.
Like at some point, the reality and the emotion should manifest itself in one way or another, and for her, it never did.
Right, and that's what I don't understand. That's why like I said, my opinion, I understand, if you think she didn't do it, I think she did it.
Yeah, to each their own. If you're on the side of the people who stand behind her and her innocence, more power to you. I'm sure you have your reasons and your feelings and your emotions behind it. But again, I personally, as somebody who just heavily, heavily researched this case, my personal opinion, I think she's sitting exactly where she should be. But that's just my opinion. And I do think that I, after doing this case, now know why not a lot of people cover a lot of child cases. And I don't think I will be doing a child case anytime soon. This was an extremely emotional and hard case to put together. It was a hard case to talk about. And
yeah, I can't even imagine. Because I just listened to it, and I don't know how many times I about broke down and started crying.
Yeah, I got emotional a lot while trying to research this case. So I don't think I will be doing any child cases anytime soon. This one really got to me. Again, I said I understand why people don't do more of those now.
Yeah.
So all I can say is rest in peace to Devin and Damon. And for anybody who listened to the case, thank you for listening and spending your time with us. And that's it for this one, I think. We are
Render the
darkness.
We were out of sync.
Let's try that again.
Render.
Let's start with we are. Let's try that again.
We are render the darkness.